We have the Right Honourable Baroness Morgan of Coates. Nikki, if you don't mind,
was... it's a mouthful otherwise.
So Nikki was Secretary of State at DCMS between 2019 and 2020, and before that a number of roles in government, Education Secretary, Financial Secretary to the Treasury, very well placed to both explain some of the approaches to AI over the past decade, but also what the challenges are that we need to address moving forward. To my right we have Matt Warman MP, the Member of Parliament for Boston and Skegness. Matt also a Minister in DCMS, specifically for digital infrastructure between 2019 and 2021, returned in 2022 to serve in government as well. First elected in 2015, has also been on things like the Science and Technology Committee, the APPG for Broadband and Digital Communications, and prior to that was a technology journalist interviewing little known names like Jeff Bezos and Tim Berners-Lee. So knows a thing or two about how some of the individuals involved in the creation of or the support of AI think about things. And finally, to my right, Richard Mullet, the Head of European Government Affairs at RELX, our partner for this event. We're enormously happy to be partnering with RELX. Richard's been leading that European Government Affairs team since 2016. And RELX, I'm sure Richard will talk about, but they provide information-based analytics and decision tools for professionals and businesses, and are a fantastic British success story, offices here across the country and working around the world. So we're going to kick off with a few comments and opening remarks from members of the panel, and then I'll probably abuse the position of chair, ask a couple of questions, and we'll come to questions from our audience. The final reminder I've been told to give you is please do take your delightful blue tote bags that you have on your seats, parade them around conference and talk about how much you enjoyed your time at the Onward Fringe and nudge people to make their way out here. So let's kick off. Applying AI, how are we going to realise the benefits of data and AI across the country, private, public sector? Nikki, can I start with you?
Well, Adam, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this fascinating topic. And you know, it's the first encouragement is that actually this is the topic that is being discussed on the Fringe at a party conference and a Conservative Party conference, because it is hugely important. I suppose the challenge in many ways is the fact that you're all here because you're interested and perhaps you know a little bit about it, you might be here to learn. I think one of the things that's holding us back is the fact that we've got to communicate some of what we're talking about today to the wider public, both in terms of public but also private sector as well. And also I'm sitting here, as you say, with having been Secretary of State for DCMS, but now also operating in the private sector as well, where issues around the use of AI and the use of data are really live topics. So I think the first thing that's probably holding back greater adoption is the need, as ever, for there to be more regulatory and political certainty, if I can put it like that. So, you know, what is the role of government? What is the role of regulators in many different ways who might be looking at the use of AI? The role of ombudsman, for example, if people have a complaint about the way that their data has been used, or the way that artificial intelligence and machine learning has used their data. And so the first thing, I think DCMS have led the way in this, but it is complicated and it is taking time, and there are some difficult questions to unravel. And so I'm sure, you know, as Matt will know, and any of you who've had to deal with ministers and government over the last couple of years, just finding sufficient bandwidth when everything else is going on to think through these complicated issues to which there are no perhaps easy or obvious answers, other than it is very easy for a minister to stand up and say, we can be world leading in this, it's very exciting, we absolutely want to set the pace, and then sit down, and then somebody else has to think, well, actually, how do we turn that into a reality? And so I think it's great that Hedden's here for the Ada, well, probably with various hats on, but Ada Lovelace and I think and others play a really important role in this, because I don't think it's the answer for how we make sure that wider spread adoption of AI, better use of data, is down to government alone. Having said about bandwidth, of course, what we saw, particularly in terms of the use of data and the openness to sharing of data, which is one of the great prizes, obviously the pandemic did accelerate in many ways some of the, both the questions, but also some of the answering of those questions. So I think the first thing is we need a genuine and probably unusual partnership between public and private sector in this space, where public sector is learning as fast and as much as the private sector is. The next thing I think is in terms of skills, and the truth is that I don't think data skills. I mean, one of the great, the employment market might be cooling a little bit, but it's been pretty hot. So actually, one of the things I think all businesses or anybody that uses data in what they are doing is struggling to find are really good data scientists, people who are confident about the use of data in their normal lives. And actually these days, and again speaking with the sort of former education secretary hat on, it's not enough just to get people to say, I want to work in the field of data, because data, and then the use of AI and machine learning that use that data is absolutely everywhere. And so in a way, I think we do need to think through, and I'm very reluctant ever to say we need to look again at the curriculum, and of course it has to happen. But we've had a lot of upheavals in education, and the last thing that I think anybody certainly in schools wants to hear is we're going to have another look at the curriculum. Having said that, I do think actually the use of data, the openness to technology, is something that we do need to think through how we are going to get our young people to be open to that, to be confident, to be aware of the careers. And as I say, it's not enough these days to say I'm going to do just data, because every job and role has a data element to it. And of course the technology, the use of AI, machine learning, runs through so many different areas now. I sit on a number of boards of private sector companies, and actually having people even non-exec directors, let alone, you can't just leave it to the director of technology to understand this. As a non-exec director, I have to try to understand how the business is using AI, how it is treating people's data, as well as are we staying up to date and complying with all the data regulations that we should. The flip side of this, and I think your sort of third question was about how do we strike the balance between stifling regulation and protecting the public interest and privacy. I think that is completely fascinating. I mean, one of the issues is how do we develop regulation that gets companies and public sector to think about unintentional biases in the use of data, the better use of risk assessments when AI is going to be used, and the intelligent use. We've seen some dreadful risk assessments where there's absolutely no value added to the debate whatsoever. So how do you get people to complete those? How do we as citizens understand how our data is being monetized and who is monetizing it? Another part of the DCMS departmental responsibilities is, of course, the regulation of tech companies and online safety. Now, I have pretty firm views about I want that bill back as quickly as possible. I think we have an opportunity here with the world of AI not to do what we've done with the tech platforms, which is to allow them to become so enormous and to consume so much of everybody's personal data that we are now playing catch up in terms of regulation. And I think my final comment will just be, it's great to say this is all very exciting. There's a real opportunity for us to be internationally competitive and world leading on this. I think all of that is true. But I think asking some of those questions at the beginning about intelligent regulation, public-private sector partnership, do people understand how their data is being used and being monetized, has to be part of that right now before we allow ourselves to get completely carried away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nikki. And just say those standing at the back, we do have a few seats here up at the front, so do feel free to come and grab those if you'd like. Matt, let me turn to you now. What's your thought on this? How do we make sure that we get AI data applied, boosted throughout the country?
No, thank you, and thank you for doing the panel. It's good that we're talking about a technology which is so often talked about as something that will replace people's jobs when being replaced is so much on the minds of Tory MPs at the moment. I think what we actually do have as an opportunity here, though, with an area that on the one hand we often talk about, and Nikki is quite right to talk about, how do you regulate a future technology in a way that is something that doesn't allow us to fall behind in the way that we have sort of fallen behind on the social media platforms in particular. But what I do think the guiding principle for AI should be is simply to say that we have a lot of principles already that are very well established. So as we use more and more AI to talk about HR decisions, for instance, you can't, as I think as Uber tried to do, for instance, you can't say, oh, this is technology. It's completely different. We need to have a whole different set of regulatory principles. I think we've got a lot of established principles that we should be applying to AI that will be much more relevant perhaps than we think. And just to fulfill your requirement to get a reference into the post office, actually, it is genuinely the case that we saw with the Horizon scandal that there was an attempt to try and say, well, the technology is something that is somehow perfect. We discovered very quickly, especially once the courts got involved, A, that that's not a good enough excuse, and B, that it is, we do have legislation that can get into those really knotty problems. So I think there is a real danger that we say that we shouldn't apply existing principles. Those existing principles are important, and they do very much apply to AI and to the data that underlies it. On the other hand, what we obviously need to do is say, where are these specific gaps that need new and different attention? One of the things that the data bill that was supposedly going to go through Parliament on the day that the new leadership was announced would have done would have been to free up some of the data sharing conundrums that stand in the way, for instance, of one part of the NHS knowing about your health records, but yet not another part of it. I think those sorts of obvious barriers can be relatively easily and with genuine public consent taken away pretty quickly. And those, to move on to the AI bit rather than the data bit, are what would allow, for instance, the NHS to really get the benefit of that huge amount of data that should allow it to be a sort of research superpower in a way that it isn't quite. Two final thoughts though. The first thing that I think the government should be thinking about when it comes to most of these principles is ultimately who is liable. And we've seen this through the driverless cars prism, is if you're going to have things that are driven by, no pun intended, but I guess it works, that are driven by AI, you have to establish whether it is the person who built the software, whether it's the person who's sitting behind the wheel, if there's a wheel. You have to be able to preserve the principles that we've got of liability, but you have to establish who it is that's liable. And those sort of basic tenets are what are going to hold things back, and we really do need to get a grip on those. And the final thing I would say is, when I was at DCMS, one of the supposed strengths was that AI was a sort of shared remit between DCMS and BEIS. In practice, it was a way of, I think, allowing things to be slowed down because it just fell between two stools. And I think if there is, in the reforming zeal of the new government, a desire to get things done, then tidying up some of those loose ends would pay massive dividends, because then it would allow the government to get on with grasping some of those nettles which are more important than ever. Nikki mentioned skills, which is hugely important, but I think I will leave it in the words of a former education secretary that it is hugely important and we shouldn't screw it up.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. Let's hand over to you, Hatan. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm going to start. Others have covered the AI aspect, so I will focus more. I'll start with R&D and data, and then if I get postscript time, I'll do AI. But you know, R&D is the kind of system within which all of this happens, right? And the key point is, do we have the talent? Is the UK open to attract the best talent? Because all of this stuff is underlined by the people. I mean, however much we try and replace the people, you know, Tory MPs included, or
everyone,
or exception, we will see. And it seems to me, on the one hand, the Conservative administration, sort of counting the last one, has got a good story to tell on this in terms of increased investment. We're getting up to 20 billion by 24-25, and that was from 15 billion previously. So there is a serious investment in this thing that could quite easily be cut. And you know, square brackets, if we're about to see public sector cuts at the moment, is this going to be the easy target that goes? So that's a bit of a worry. But actually, I think that some of the wider signals have not gone down well in the wider world. And in fact, the good bit about the spend hasn't cut through, sadly. All of the issues around associating with the Horizon programme in Europe, which is basically you know, caught up in the Northern Ireland Protocol, that's causing incredible uncertainty within the research community. So in terms of holding on to or bringing in talent, that's been an issue, I think. Our visa regime for scientists and their families is still not that good. It's pretty expensive. I mean, it's a minor friction, but you just want to reduce all those frictions all the way through the system. And just the wider signals. I mean, we still don't have a science minister. It's been 2.5 months. I think Nusrat Ghani is about to be announced, but she still hasn't yet been. And again, the science community is sort of feeling like, are we being prioritised? The government got rid of the National Science and Technology Council, which Patrick Vallance had set up, a prime ministerial chaired council. Now again, this may well just be a sort of quirk of we're getting rid of lots of committees, but these signals don't necessarily suggest that all of these things are kind of top of mind for this administration, which is surprising given the long-term route to growth is R&D, I think, or it's a key bit of it. Turning to the sort of data bit, UK has got brilliant quality data sets. It's got the Office for National Statistics, which I think did a heroic job during the pandemic, really stepped up to the plate. But I think as the economy becomes more and more digital in the way that we're talking about, actually it really creates problems for statisticians to understand what the heck is going on in the economy. So in the old days with GDP, somebody pays somebody else, you can track that. Now you do a Google search, there was no money that changed hands, but clearly the economy is better off as a result of it. How do statisticians cope with this? How do we understand all of these sort of intangible effects which are going on within the economy? And looping back to productivity growth, which we've had woeful productivity growth for 15 years, we need data to kind of get under the hood of all of that. So we need better local and regional data. We just need to kind of start getting into, I think the private sector is increasingly holding the data that we need. And my instinct is that you might find in the next decade, the Office of National Statistics is doing more curation of other people's collected data rather than their own. If you want to know what's happening to inflation, actually is scanner data the place to go, rather than trying to collate your own baskets of goods, etc. Just on the skills point, I agree it's hard to reopen the whole thing, but there is one little instrument which is called Core Maths, which I think we could roll out very quickly. So this is for those students post-16 that don't do A-level maths. There's a very nice little thing, which is, although it's called maths, it's really data. And I think, as Nikki said, every job now involves data. If you're a teacher, you're collecting the data on your students, ... So it's not just about the high end. Actually, we're all data users now, and how do we do that? And then finally on AI, I suppose it's the classic thing that tech is always outrunning regulation and legislation. Very much agree with Matt that you need to think in the context of each industry it's not you need some special AI bill. You need every regulator to say, well, what is it going to mean in my industry, and some are doing better than others on that. And just to kind of finish, you've kindly mentioned the Ada Lovelace Institute. It's an institute I helped set up at the Nuffield Foundation, and it's independently funded, no technology firm funding, which I think is helpful in terms of the landscape. Just as an example of the work we've done on biometrics, which is sort of facial recognition, voice recognition, all of those technologies which are kind of hitting us very quickly, but we don't really know how to regulate. We took a two-pronged approach. We got a QC to do a kind of review of all the legislation and where the gaps are, but we also did a deliberative council of 100 citizens who actually learnt about the technologies and said, these are where we want the lines to be drawn. And I think you need both. I think you need experts, but I think you need the public. And it's about how do we get that community voice, because I think with a lot of these digital technologies, we sort of feel quite powerless at the end of the day. Stuff has been, how can you opt out of these technologies which are now infrastructures, as it were, of information? And so I think in the way, if you look back to the GM scandal, in the 90s, that there was the technology lost the social license, and as a result we lost a lot of innovation. And I think to maintain the social license, we actually need to take the public with us, but that's not just about communication, that's actually about listening and giving them some power. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. A lot there to unpack as we get to the discussion. But let me bring you in, Richard. So obviously you kind of work in this space, kind of bread and butter of your industry is to try and overcome some of these barriers and deal with them and help companies deal with them. So what are your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, Adam. And perhaps I should first explain a little bit more about who RELX is and what we do and why we are engaged in this debate. So as you've said, we're a FTSE 12 UK headquartered global data analytics company. We have a business, Elsevier, which is the world's leading scientific research publisher platform, LexisNexis, the leading legal platform, and we also have data analytics in a number of industry areas like aviation, petrochemicals. We do the gas benchmark pricing, which is very busy team at the moment. Threat metrics, tackling financial fraud and digital ID fraud. So it's a broad range of areas, but common to them all, and indeed our exhibitions business, is data and the use of data for good, for the social goods that we've talked about, and increasingly using machine learning tools to help improve our decision-making capabilities, or capabilities that we sell into the professional teams we work to. And I think, we don't have a unique perspective, but it's quite unusual in that we get to see a lot about research. Using our Scopus database, we have about 81 million data points, so we can advise research funders, institutions, universities, even governments about where the research is going, who's doing it, how impactful is it, who are they collaborating with, and really importantly, are we doing better or worse than our competitors? But we also do a lot. We are a data company, we invest in R&D, we acquire small companies or small bits of technologies which we bolt into our own. So we're constantly looking around the world for where we should invest, building tech hubs as we've done recently in London and Amsterdam. And the other sort of unusual perspective we have is that we are both data owners and data users. So again, our Elsevier business, that science platform we have, it's freely available to researchers at public institutions to text and data mine. But of course, on the commercial world, we are licensing that data out to pharma companies and hedge funds and whoever wants to buy it off us. But we also license in data. So some of you here may use LexisNexis Newswire, one of our products. We obviously license in that news data. So we understand the control and access points of this. But to the questions, can data and AI boost R&D? We'd say, well, yes, of course it can, but as has been said already, it's not the only thing. You need money, you need the skills and the talent to absorb that money. I think the UK's 2.4% GDP target's okay, it's in the ballpark, but it's behind the EU on 3, US 3.5, Korea out there at 4.8. So if we're serious about this, there needs to be more political ambition to it. Secondly, yes, you can boost R&D through AI, but as again has been said, it's probably going last, isn't it? It's about the regulatory regime around it, and we've got a nice natural experiment going on at the moment because you have the EU, which is following the approach I think you were sort of implicitly criticising perhaps, Matt, of having a broad horizontal regulation and just saying anything that's called AI obeys this, and there'll be a few things that are high risk, and we'll see how that goes. Whereas the approach being set out by BEI seems a much more sensitive, let's not have one overarching bit, but let's apply AI regulation on a case-by-case, sector-by-sector basis. Let the medical regulators decide what they need to do with the financial regulators. And that seems to us to be a better approach, but with time will tell. There's a danger things fall between the stools, perhaps. And then thirdly, can you boost R&D with AI and data? Yes, you can, but you've got to be sure not to harm other bits of the economy along the way. And our one criticism of what the government's proposing at the moment is where it says, well, anyone who wants to do text and data mining, come on in and get the data. Come and get the data of who? Well, the creative industries, not just us in scientific publishing, but if you look at what's happening with AI in music at the moment, in AV, where rights holders got these incredible assets that they can now turn into even more incredible things using AI. And the government's proposal seems to be to say, well, you haven't got copyright in that anymore. And that's going to take a lot of money off the table for researchers, and actually I think will drive AI elsewhere, because who is going to invest in making data available to AI to use if they can't get any money for that investment? So I think the government, saying they might think again, that I really think they should. But that's my 5 minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate it. Huge amount there, right? So regulation, on skills, on economic development, and a lot that we're going to dive into. I'm going to abuse my position though and ask one question, which is about investment zones. So a big pillar of this government's economic development strategy is around investment zones, kind of draw a line around an area, a set of incentives in order to boost economic growth and development. I worry that the kind of image that sometimes conjures up is very manufacturing intensive, right? So, and that's actually aided by the fact that a lot of the incentives are around tangible capital or around buildings and superproduction for capital investments. Now, don't get me wrong, Onward have done lots of work on manufacturing. It's an important part of the economy, but it clearly cannot be the entire of your approach to economic development. So I guess my question is, if the government called you up and said, we want an investment zone that is about data and AI, we're going to plonk it here in the country, probably somewhere where there are some existing assets, what would you want to have in that zone? What would be the flexibility, the regulatory divergence, the incentive, the skills program. What's the thing that would make that zone work? And I'm going to come to our two non-politicians before I come to two politicians. So Hetan, let me start with you first. What would you want a data and AI investment zone to look like?
Yeah, so I think a logical thing to do is say we're going to plonk a new university there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, that's the level of R&D ambition I think you need. If you say, you look at what universities are doing now, they're becoming more and more civic hubs in their areas, as it were. And they're playing, at their best, they're playing a role linking up data sets for local authority, for civil society and business. So that I think there's that. And then on the skills end, you've got this lifelong learning entitlement, which is on the books. Why don't you bring in something where you say, actually, you're going to not have to pay that back? So that's a serious investment in skills.
Fantastic. Admirably focused on those two policy measures. Excellent. Okay, Richard, what would you want to see in an investment zone for data?
I think we would say there should be something along the lines of the R&D tax credit, but not the R&D tax credit, but something more like the Dutch innovation box. The R&D tax credit is okay, but it's paid retrospectively. Yeah. And so it's not really much of an incentive because you only find out at the end of your project if you're going to get the tax credit. Whereas the innovation box is a much more collaborative idea. The government sits down with the would-be innovator, you say what you're going to try and do, and they say, well, if that works out, we won't tax your profits at, I think it's 13%, we'll tax them at 9%. And that can spur innovation. So if you're setting up these super innovation zones, why not have that as a tax regime for innovative companies within them?
Fantastic. I'm stealing all of these for an Onward. Please do. This is great. Just collecting them as we go. Matt, let's come to you next.
I mean, I think investment zones are a really interesting and confusing idea, because if you were to sort of say, to answer your question, what would you like in it? Well, actually, maybe the best answer is Cambridge or something. Mm-hmm. Like, actually, you should be. Your challenge is: do you want to build on success, or do you want to try and do something new? And I think for this, the logical thing is not to try and start some new institution. But what I would say is I would focus on immigration if I'm only allowed to focus on one thing. And so why is there not? Why do you not have, for instance, visa-free travel for people with the right PhD? To take one example, or with degrees from institutions that fulfil a certain set of criteria, because it is about building that critical mass and then trying to supercharge it. And that is not about buildings; it has to be about talent above all.
Excellent. Thank you.
I think it's a really fascinating question, and I'd like to think that the Treasury are pondering it now. I suppose you could do a blend of the two. I was just thinking about, going back to the original question, a lot of our SMEs who might well be in opportunities. I'm trying to remember what the name of the one in Nottingham. You'll have legal people, you'll have tax people employed, particularly when there's sort of instability. Actually, knowing you should be doing more in terms of the use of data and or other technologies, you just haven't got the bandwidth. So I suppose the question is whether the investment zone could create or help businesses to create that bandwidth. And the other thing is, in financial services, you've got things like the regulatory sandbox, as have the ICO. Just taking, I don't know if it's the same, I haven't heard about the Dutch innovation box, but whether you could create almost like a physical sandbox, no sand needed, but where actually people are encouraged to innovate and somehow given almost like a safe harbour, if you like, as long as they're innovating within a particular regulatory framework.
Direct them to particular panellists, if that's okay. So, hands straight up there, hands up behind you there, and hand over here.
Of edtech, so basically technology-enabled learning. Some of those are targeted at children. A lot of the time, when that's AI-enabled, the data is collected for over 18s. Children learn and behave very differently. There are obviously significant risks in that space, and also perhaps benefits we're not using. For very, very good reasons, there are restrictions on collecting data for under 18s. But if under 18s will be using learning technology, is there perhaps a way around that? And one question, if it's all right, to Matt Warman, really interested in the Future of Work review. There was a mention of what might be happening to that later, and is there any update on that?
Fantastic. Okay, so questions there on EdTech, what's the regulatory balance, and around the Future of Work Commission, as you said. Second question.
Yes, R&D tax relief, I know Richard just touched on it. Obviously it's being reformed at the moment, but overseas R&D seems to be scrapped. And obviously this is a particular area for the data skills sets, and it's really important. I'd really like to know the view from the panel of whether it should be reinstated, given we don't actually have those skill sets in this country.
Excellent. R&D tax credits, international relief. A very policy-dense question there. We like that. That's fantastic. Okay, a question up there.
Hi, my name's Simon. I'm a retired data architect. My question is really about the skills. We've always struggled to get people out of universities with maths and computer science degrees. It's still not very sexy, I think the word is these days. I just wonder if there's any traction in making the fees for university students cheaper for those sort of technical subjects, and perhaps loading some subjects which aren't as attractive to industry to compensate it, to make it cost neutral.
Excellent. Making maths sexy again. Regulation in EdTech, future work, R&D tax credits. Vicky, let me come to you first, particularly on this question around EdTech, given your kind of background there, but feel free to touch on some of the others too.
So I think it's such an interesting question. I think it goes to the heart of, so I'm actually certain there are ways in which you hesitate to go on about it, but it's such an important part of what we need to get restarted, the online safety bill, which is this issue about drawing distinction between protecting children more than we're protecting adults, and I think that's where we'll end up. So I'm absolutely certain you could do something along the lines of offering more, let's say, more protection for children's data. With a broader education hat, though, I think you've got, before we even get to there, you've got to engage both teachers, again, who've got limited bandwidth, and many of whom actually have not started their teaching careers using EdTech, using data, educating parents about the way their children's data is being used, and encouraging people that the default is not no when they're asked a question about do you give permission for your children's data to be collected. And then I think we've got this balance between, and we haven't quite, I mean, COVID, the pandemic, did change in many ways the understanding that, of course, you can use technology in terms of delivering learning, but the truth is we've reverted pretty much to quite standard things. So I remember going around, the people tell me about these fantastic products and all this is going to help and everything else. We're still in quite an analogue age in our education, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing, but there's a bigger, broader debate to be had. So I think a lot more, but I would have thought it's the sort of thing where, given the current government's growth agenda, and actually tying that through into education, this is an opportunity. If people have great ideas, this is the moment in which to sell them in and to explain the opportunities and protections that can be offered. Just touching on I just wanted to, Sarah, about your data architect. So I'm also a non-exec director of the Careers and Enterprise Company, which is about helping schools to offer great careers advice and everything else. And I bet if I said I met a data architect, people wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about. And so actually the point is we've got to, if we're going to really engage the public and get people thinking about all of this, then before we can get to things like tuition fees and everything else, and I think the government will always, and universities themselves will have an issue with variable fees, actually we've got to explain what we mean by these careers. What did you actually do when you were working? What do we need in terms of data capabilities? And then just the middle question about skill set. Yeah, I get the thing about international relief, and that's fine, but there is a debate, and don't forget this is where we ended up where we did in 2016 with the vote that we had, which is actually if we're not growing our own skill set at home and making it sustainable, migration of course is important, bringing in highly skilled people, but the answer cannot continue to be we're going to import all the skills from overseas. We've got to do better at explaining in our education world what the roles are that are out there, how technology is changing, and how we're going to get people to do those jobs. So I'm sure the government will be interested, given their growth agenda, in looking at R&D and international relief. But if you're going to do that, you've got to do something more sustainable for people in this country in terms of creating great roles.
Heta, let me come to you, in particular those two questions about R&D tax credits and the kind of international angle, but also the question here about how we get more people studying maths and computer science and how we then get them out into private sector.
Yeah, thanks. So on R&D tax credits, I'm sure you're right that would be a useful thing to do. I mean, I've got a different beef with them, which is that they explicitly exclude social science and humanities research. Whereas the OECD manual says, and if you look at what the private sector is doing these days, if you go into companies like Unilever or Netflix or whatever, so much of their research is about behaviour. So actually we're excluding a whole set of stuff that actually the private A-level maths has become hugely popular from where it was 10 years ago. So actually I think although it's still something to worry about, I think it's something less to worry about than it used to be. I mean, there's a funny answer and a kind of less funny answer. You know, the term data science has made stats sexy again. Every statistician is rebranded as data scientists and tripled their salary. I mean, it's and the labour market, and they kind of see the opportunities. The other thing which is very interesting and has emerged quite recently is the number of employers who've set up or they have sponsored conversion courses into data science for people with a master's degree in anything else. You can now do a 10-week course which basically gets you up to sort of basic data science, and it's filling gaps. Now, these people are not, you know, they don't know everything, but I think that there is a kind of market that has emerged which has actually been quite a good thing.
There we go. Only at an Onward event does a point about the scope of R&D tax credits get a literal cheer from the audience. Very, very proud of that. Richard, let's come to you. I want to stay on this topic of R&D tax credits because we do a lot of work on the apprenticeship levy as well, and it feels like both of them are things which everyone hates, and no one can really agree how they should be reformed and improved. Everyone has slightly different ideas. So how do you think, you know, you mentioned briefly there are some good elements, some that don't work, but the international element particularly, what should be done with them?
Well, one of the things we talk to the Treasury about is what the base is. You know, what activity is being captured in the first place, an incentive, a company determining where it's going to put its investment as a headline rate of one bit of its activity. So important though they are, I guess one mustn't over-fixate on just that part of the R&D story. You know, what makes a company go to location X or Y? Well, it's R&D tax credit, but it's tax rate, it's skills base, it's all of those things. And just I want to add to Hatton, I had somebody in my European Government Affairs team, historian, politician, student, who we transferred over to become a data scientist, doing exactly that, and he's now writing code for a living instead of sort of looking at laws. So
Well, it's quite interesting. It was classicists who were employed by Bletchley Park.
Yes.
You know, at the time
Yeah.
there were no data
Great.
science.
Yeah.
And it's all about piecing together fragments of information.
Yeah. There's hope for us humanities students, yeah. And Matt, for you, so in particular this question about the Future of Work Commission earlier.
Former Prime Minister saying this is where future government work should focus and all that sort of thing. So one of the things that I'm going to try and do after conference is at least try and prod the government into making sure it does not just evaporate in my absence. I don't know if that necessarily means appointing a new reviewer, but I think certainly giving it some ministerial patience around flexible working, around what that means in a world where more and more people have got questions about workers' rights and also have got questions about how they're able to take on caring responsibilities that are what allow them to go to work if they're done properly and what force them to drop out of the workforce if they don't. And just on